I'll talk a bit about challenges that we face and things for the future. And then Michael will talk after me, and then David Rosenthal about Memento aggregation issues. So first, some updates. We've been working for about 3 years on the internet draft to become an RFC that specifies Memento, and we're now at version 07, and we've done actually a major revision of the draft. It's all backwards compatible, but the structure is significantly different, and that's as a result of feedback that we received from people implementing Memento, especially people not working in web archives but with versioning systems, where different kind of patterns exist. You may remember that in the initial internet drafts we always talked about a remote time gate, the notion being that the original resource lives here, and in web archives and typically the time gate lives elsewhere because that's where all the mementos also are. When you have a versioning system like a wiki or so, all of these things can reside in the same environment, and that allows for other kind of implementation patterns. So the new draft takes all of that into account. Actually, it's much easier to read, and somehow, and that's kind of weird, we opened up more implementation possibilities, but the client implementation has become easier because of that, which came as a surprise to ourselves. The draft now focuses on the daytime negotiation component, so content negotiation in time, and on the notion of timestamps, so these lists of the mementos that are available. The discovery component we cut out, and that's for several reasons. One, no one was using them yet. We didn't really have a good understanding, and actually we're very happy we cut it out because David then came up with a couple of issues that we should resolve and that I think should become part of maybe another spec that is about discovery as such. This version is now in review by the IETF. And so we're hopeful that in the next couple of months it will become an RFC. We're very happy with this version, actually. Then a less nice story, but a very interesting story. We spent the last year investing a lot of time and energy to try and get Memento native support in Wikipedia. So you do that by filing a bug report, and basically you say, well, you know what, your environment doesn't support Memento, and it should because you have all these versions and so. And so the first phase of that is editors of Wikipedia that discuss the problem. Should we have that, should we not? And the outcome of that was actually really positive. So on the one hand, you had the people that don't want to make it easier to look at old versions of stuff, which we also have in archives. You have people that don't want to look at the past, but then we said, well, wikis are all about showing the versions, so why not make them easier accessible? And so, on the other hand, you had the people that talk about Memento is a really cool idea, and Wikipedia and the MediaWiki Foundation should be in a position to actually support that. Next phase was technology review. We invested an awful lot of time to make the plugin that we had created for MediaWiki more robust, going back on their feedback and so. Anyhow, to cut a long story short, we invested about a year's work in that, and just a couple of weeks ago we got the message that they were not going to implement it because it would take them too much time to support it. Basically meaning really two things. One, the plugin wasn't still robust enough for them to be able to support it, because once they support it, it's for them to do. That's a problem that can be addressed. The bigger issue here is that they basically said, as long as there's no native browser support, we are not going to do it because everyone now needs a plugin in order to use that functionality, and we're not in that kind of business. So that for us is a big lesson. We learned a lot from this, but we understand that we're facing a significant challenge. You may remember last year I talked about the imminent release of our transactional archiving software. That's now been released, so it's available on GitHub in open source. I would love if this community would do some experimentation with it. So it's a completely different paradigm than crawler-based archiving. This basically works with a plugin that you install on a server that has to be archived, and then every time a client accesses the server, the response is obviously sent to the client, but is also pushed into an archive. The archive is obviously Memento compatible, and there's possibilities to offload the archive data into WARC files, for example, to upload it in a longer-term archive, for long-term access. Okay. Soon, probably this week actually, we'll release a test version of this, whereby people don't have to install the archive software itself. So we'll basically provide an instance in the cloud that they can play around with. So the only thing they would have to do is install the plugin on their server. This is created for Apache servers, by the way. And then they can test how the archiving in the cloud would work. I think this is a very promising technology. Some of you may remember that I did a little demo last year on how these new challenging kind of web pages that have a lot of JavaScript, a lot of interaction, were actually successfully archived using transactional archiving. You may remember I had this little demo of the shared canvas annotation environment and all. And so we're able to actually archive using transactional archiving these kind of things, which I think for robot-based archiving is a significant challenge. Memento aggregator, and now I'm talking about the one that is used by Memento Fox. So Memento Fox, when it doesn't find a link to a time gate, automatically goes to this aggregator. So we've had a version in place for about 2.5–3 years. We've rewritten the software, and this week actually, as we speak, we're putting a new, more robust aggregator software into production. So that's a version based on Java and Nginx. We will make that software available for download also. I'll come back to that later, but my hope is that some of you may want to install an aggregator also, and that we could have a little ecology of these kind of aggregators, so that they don't all have to come through the one at Lenel, which, if the technical people at the lab decide we're not going to provide a service like that anymore, then we at least have fallback mechanisms elsewhere. So that's happening this week. You also remember that we have a project with the IIPC to build an aggregator that actually is based on collecting metadata from all the different archives. We did collect more up-to-date information from various web archives, and actually there were quite some challenges involved in doing so. And we're currently working on staging them to a server where we can process this. And there's challenges involved in that also. I cannot promise when the results of that will become available. It probably may take another 2 or 3 months. All of this was based on making the metadata available in ad hoc kind of ways. Some have actually been delivered on hard disks, some were FTP'd over, what have you not. At the last year's IPC meeting, we had a quick brainstorm about more automatic ways to make this happen, so a more sustainable machine-driven approach to gather that metadata to a central spot. There's been no progress with that regard. You may remember that we demonstrated the TimeUp plugin also, and then collected some feedback from all of you. We've incorporated that feedback, and the client is starting to look really nice. So I'm rather confident that when we have the new release of this aggregator, we'll have an updated TimeUp client also that actually looks really neat and accommodates some of the requests you had. Good news with regard to native support of Memento by web archives. We now have the UK National Archives that are compliant, and the British Library web archive. Archive.it is not yet natively compliant, but has made it easier for us to implement a proxy to it, because they have now the notion of an all collection. Remember, Archive.it has all these different collections that have numbers. It was pretty hard for a Memento proxy to deal with that. Now with the all collection, that's become easier. Of course, nicer would be if Archive.it would also become natively compliant. And then Internet Archive has been compliant for quite a while, but there remains some open issues about closer integration of the Memento access point and the regular Wayback access point. There's some bugs, and the specification has changed a bit since this was made compliant, so it would be good if we could get that updated. We have the software available. Actually, we have 2 versions of the software available. So it's somehow a matter of getting that into production. Memento funding, of course, that's kind of not unimportant. Our funding of the Library of Congress ends very soon. That's in May, I think, right, Michael? I have a project with the University of Edinburgh called Hyperlink that's related to Memento and scholarly communication. It's really about citation rod, about link rod. So it's not about developing Memento infrastructure, but it's about using Memento to study the problem of citation rod at a very large scale. So we're talking about millions and millions of scholarly papers that we're going to mine and look at the decay of links in there. So it's actually a rather interesting project. And then Michael has just submitted a small proposal to the Mellon Foundation related to the Wikipedia issue, basically aimed at creating a robust version for the MediaWiki plugin. So the one that we have available works, it's just not up to standards for the MediaWiki Foundation, so they won't support it. And basically I think the idea is that Michael would dedicate some time of a student to dig deeper into the coding practices of MediaWiki in order to make that plugin more robust. So that's basically an update. A couple of challenges I do want to share with you, because I hope this community can help us in resolving some of these. The first one I already alluded to is the chicken and egg problem. Servers will not support Memento when there's no client support, when there's no native browser support, and browser manufacturers are not going to support it when there's not enough server support. And it's very hard, and so that's what we saw with Wikipedia also, and it's a very hard thing to break. We've also been in touch with Opera. They're kind of the ones that adhere to all standards and are rather early to implement new features. They were not really interested, again citing, well, there's hardly any service that support it, why would we invest the time and energy to support it in our browser? So we really need a breakthrough in this realm. We hope that when Memento reaches RFC stage, that may lower the threshold a little bit, but I don't expect any miracles there. So what we need here is not only adoption by web archives, but also by versioning systems that are out there, like wikis, GitHub, and what have you not. Memento aggregation, which is really the topic of this session, and both Michael and David will talk about that more. So the first thing to understand is that Memento aggregation really only comes into play when a server doesn't provide a link to a preferred time gate. In the current situation, that's almost in 99.9% of the cases, because there's hardly any servers that do express a preference. So but the first lesson here is that the more of these time gate links we can put in there, the better, because that means we don't need to go to a Memento aggregator when these links are provided. So that could be links provided by web servers that say, well, if you want to see my past content, then probably the best is to go to that archive. And in the US, that may be the Internet Archive. In UK, that may be another archive. So one could imagine putting natively in web servers these kind of links in place. And then, of course, again, going back to version control systems like wikis, These could also have the time gate links and the memento functionality. Having said all of that, so a focus on let's try and get these time gate links out there, memento aggregation still remains essential. At this moment, because there's hardly any memento compatible systems out there, and hence no links, no time gate links. In the future, it's still going to be important because you, in many cases, want to look across multiple archives, not just one. So aggregation will remain important in the future also. That's why it deserves quite some attention from us. Currently, and I've already alluded to that, we really have two different approaches to memento aggregation. And they're based on the classic paradigms. One is distributed search paradigm, and the other is a metadata aggregation paradigm. And so the distributed search paradigm, that's like the aggregator that is currently used by the Memento Fox plugin. Basically what it does, it gets a request, and then dynamically it pulls different archives for their content. Which kind of mementos do you have? And then it kind of looks at the responses and then redirects a client to the most appropriate memento. Like all distributed search paradigms, it really has an issue. As the number of archives increases, your response times decreases, and so the satisfaction for the end user will decrease there also. One can optimize that by doing some pre-caching, some clever caching mechanisms and so on, but fundamentally there is that problem, as we know, in distributed searching paradigms. The other paradigm is the metadata harvesting one, which is the IAPC aggregator. So here we're talking about, let's collect all that metadata from all the archives, the web archives in the world, and let's put them all together in one big pot. Now you have speed of query, of course, but the infrastructure needed to do all of that work. One, basically moving all the data across, and two, processing that, and then three, running that operation is actually rather challenging, as we've seen in the last year and a half. It's something you could compare to a DUI resolver. It's very similar. They aggregate DUIs, they aggregate metadata about DUIs, and then they resolve them. It's very similar, only the scale that we talk about is much, much bigger. As far as I know, there's about 100 million DUIs out there. There's plenty more mementos, as you know. So the scale is very different. All of this to say that these are the things that we're currently working with and experimenting with and actually have in production. But it may be time to explore another paradigm for aggregation also. And I'll come to that in a minute. So going back to next steps, I'm going to start with a plea to this community actually. We need some advocacy around Memento. And the Memento team are technologists, we're not the best at advocacy. And I think the IPC is, one of the things you could do for us is advocate the use of Memento, promote it out there. You have connections maybe with browser manufacturers, you may have connections with people that devise version control systems and so on. I think we need some more word of mouth about Memento, how it could be a solution to access the web of the past. So, and of course further adoption of Memento natively by your web archives would be great. Again, this is something in which we can help, but I think we're not in the best position as a Memento team, as technologists, to approach each of these kind of parties at the high level to start that discussion. So again, a plea on my behalf, or on behalf of the Memento team, for the IAPC to help us out in this. Second, at the level of technology, and I'm now talking about the rather near-term future, we need to deploy second generation of the Memento aggregator. As I said, we have new software that implements the distributed search paradigm. That software has been created with the purpose of being easy to distribute to other partners. So as I said before, I could imagine that we build a little ecology of aggregators around the world, maybe with the shared front end, and I could imagine such aggregators being deployed in your institutions if you have the resources. We'll do one. I'm assuming that Michael will do one at Old Dominion again, but I could imagine other institutions that could be willing to operate one. We could have a front end that is shared and then fanning out, maybe based on IP addresses. That all has to be discussed. But I could imagine that this would be a solution that could work for the next 2-3 years while we're looking into other approaches for memento aggregation. The other important bit here, and this is working towards native adoption of memento by browser manufacturers, is making the footprint of MementoFox, so the plugin that we have for Firefox, as small as possible. And I indicated before that the good news there is that with the new internet draft, it has become easier to implement Memento functionality in the browser. So we have an effort ongoing to reduce that footprint and make it as simple as possible so that we could more easily approach browser manufacturers to try and convince them at the technological level that it's not all that hard to plug it into their browsers. Of course, we still need some high-level contact to be established before we can start that technical discussion. And then I alluded to it before, we'll create a robust MediaWiki plugin. That will start then to promote on the MediaWiki list in general, hoping that multiple instances of MediaWiki want to install it, and maybe that way, eventually Wikipedia and all the national Wikipedias will also start adopting it. In the longer term, and this brings me to the topic that both Michael and David will discuss, we'll need to look into other kind of paradigms for memento aggregation. So again, we currently have two paradigms, distributed searching and metadata harvesting. We'll need to explore whether other approaches can be devised. An approach that Michael and I have been brainstorming about ever since the start of the Memento project is a rules-based kind of engine, where basically you would have a profile, a meta profile of different archives. Something along, and Michael will talk about that, something along the lines of, oh, if I need this kind of a URI between, in this kind of time frame, then most likely that's the best archive. So we're now not talking about, I need all the metadata about these archives. No, I need the summarization of their content. What exactly that summarization is, we don't know yet. But once you would have such a meta-level summarization, you could then devise rules. And now you talk about a very lightweight aggregator that would be based on rules rather based on searching or on actual metadata. So that's something that we may want to explore. There may be other paths also. David will talk about a couple of problems that point in the direction that memento aggregation and so resolution of a request may in certain cases be more complicated than we anticipated. And for example, it relates to access rights. And this, where one person may have access to these mementos in a certain archive, but another person may not. And that brings you to the notion of context-dependent resolution of memento requests. And that brings me back 15 years now, when you may remember, some of you, I did the OpenURL framework, which addressed the appropriate copy problem in the journal system. And that was all about, well, if I have my subscription for this journal with EBSCO rather than with Sweats, then this link should be resolved in that direction, not in that. And that was the OpenURL framework that was introduced for that purpose. I'm not saying that's the same kind of solution we could use here. I'm just saying the problem domain has some interesting similarities. But again, this is more explorative. This is something that I think Michael, David, and I would like to invest some research time into looking at what should we be doing 2 years from now, 3 years from now, what should we have in place for memento aggregation to augment what we currently have. And that was it. I think I'll pass it on to Michael. Shall we have questions at the end of this?